Hello, everyone. Welcome to today's webinar brought to you by the CMO Council and our friends over at KPMG. This is going to be the first in a series of 4 webinars we're going to be hosting over the month of May to help marketers maximize returns from prior investments, effectively manage assets and agencies, and improve plan and spend agility. In this critical time, our goal is that attendees will come away from each webinar in the series with immediate actions your organization can take in the next 30, 60, and 90 days. I'm today's moderator. My name is Sally Lopez. I am the Senior Director of Marketing and Operations over at the CMO Council. And my featured guests today are Jason Galloway, who's the Managing Director in KPMG's U.S. Customer Advisory Practice and serves as its marketing consulting practice lead, as well as Craig Rutkowski, who's the director in KPMG's U.S. Customer Advisory Marketing Consultant Practice and who has 15 years of experience in marketing technology. So both subject matter experts for today. A big welcome to Jason and Craig. In today's webinar, we're going to be tackling the topic of how to obtain the greatest return possible from prior Martech investments. As many of us already know, marketers have a sizable Martech stack with tools that are underutilized, underperforming, or frankly just sitting idle. In the days and months ahead, marketers will have to make the most out of what they already have. So today we're going to be focusing on specific actions marketers can take in the next 2 quarters to drive more value from their existing Martech stack. We'll also share some top-line findings from the Martech survey that many of you took prior to the webinar. Thank you so much for that, and don't worry, you're still going to have a chance to participate in the survey after the webinar in order to receive that complimentary summary of findings. After the presentation, we are going to save some time for Q&A at the end, but please feel free to submit your questions at any time during the webinar because I may be taking little pauses here and there to answer some of those. And as a note, in order to just get the best experience, I'd recommend using the full screen option, which you can find by just hovering over the bottom right corner of the screen. And that's just going to let you get the full screen view of this presentation deck. As a note, I'm going to be following up with everyone afterwards with a link to this deck and the webinar on demand so you can review it again in the future. So with all of that housekeeping out of the way, I am going to hand it over to Jason to kick us off with just the big picture. So Jason, can you give us an overview of the current situation, the challenges that marketers are facing, and what the key needs are in prioritizing their Martech assets?
Yeah, absolutely, Sally. And hey, really thanks for the opportunity to be here today. I know both Craig and I are excited. Frankly, a topic that's near and dear to my heart as a guy who's been doing marketing technology since the early 2000s and have kind of seen things change and ebb and flow through so many different changes over the last, I guess, almost 20 years now. So excited to be here and talk to everybody today. Really, as we think about how things are changing, and obviously everybody knows about all the craziness that's going on there right now, but we really need to be focused more now than ever of how do we get more out of the marketing technology we have, right? With marketing budgets being cut, the money just isn't there for that new technology. In the past, 6 months ago, we would say, great, I'll just go buy something new and that can help me. But now I have to really focus on how do I get more out of what I already have, right? So 81% of brands are saying they're cutting their budgets. 73% of brands are saying they don't expect any sales growth this year. So it's so much more important, especially when about 50 to 60% of marketers are saying that there's significant changes to the overall customer journey. So how do we continue to engage with our customers and create delightful experiences where we can, right? So what we're really going to focus on in the conversation today is really about the things that you can do between now and the end of the year, right? I heard somebody recently say that the future is 90 days, right? No longer is the future 3 years from now, a year from now. It's really what do we need to do in the next 3 to 6 months. So as we talked about budgets being cut, really those opportunities then to make those changes really aren't there anymore, right? So we need to think about how do we get the most value out of what do I have? How do I maximize that value? Most marketers report about 25 to 30% of their budget being spent on marketing technology, and with most organizations having on average about 50 different pieces of technology. I frankly have one client right now that has over 145 pieces of technology. So if you think about just not only the complexity of all of that different technology, but also the amount of dollars that you're spending on the current technology as well. So it's about trying to get more, right? And about 50% of CMOs, only 50% of CMOs say that they're successful in acquiring and managing that technology. Frankly, that's a large part of your budget for only half of those CMOs out there in marketing organizations to say that they're actually really good at acquiring and managing it and getting the value, right? And so as we start to really think about so many new channels and new technology and new vendors out there, that's really helped resolve some of these problems, right? So, but as marketers, we're still responsible for helping to deliver on that CX expectation, right? Not over-investing, but also not under-investing, right? We need to make sure that we're trying to obtain that analytical insight. How do we make sure that we have the right insights at the right time? We'll talk a little bit about that. And then also ensuring operational agility. More now than ever, where we've all been transformed almost overnight and have to work from home and working remotely. How do I make sure that I'm able to be agile in the way that I work, but also the ability to change campaigns? Our world changed overnight and we need the ability to be agile. And last, most importantly, where we frankly spend a lot of time talking, is proving the value of that marketing technology. How do I make sure I have that business case to say, this is what the value is I'm going to get at the end of the day, and this is why it's important to our organization. Sorry, should I get the slide changed here? So really we're looking at kind of a fresh approach is needed, right? And there's kind of four major areas that we like to think about. First is getting a complete perspective, right? Start to think about that clear linkage to the business strategy. We're going to talk just a minute from now about the survey that people have already taken. And what we see is there's a real deficit there, right? Linking your marketing technology back to your strategy, right? And thinking about the management across the overall tech lifecycle. It's not just enough to implement it. You have to think about how I'm managing it throughout the process. Then also think about the clear tie to organizational needs. Once again, it's about driving that strategy. It's not about fixing just the pain points. It's about drawing the line between the pain point and the strategy. Obviously, everybody's in a lot of pain today. So you can't just throw tech at it. It needs to make sure that it's driving revenue. The next is effective integration, right? So to facilitate that great CX experience, we need to make sure that I have better insights and better integrations to the rest of the organization, both technology and non-technology, right? It's a critical component. It's one of the most critical components is that integration. Unfortunately, research only shows about 18% of people think integration is critical when implementing new technology. If you want to look at the customer experience and streamline it and creating a better experience, that needs to be important. If you to fully understand kind of those implications of integration, if you think about like best of breed, right, versus a platform. So you have to think about those integrations ahead of time. If you go with, say, in a Primo for marketing operations, or you think about a Salesforce, or you think of some of these more platform type plays, they have some of that stuff built in. But if you go best of breed, you need to think about that even more. The next is the area of new KPIs. And we're going to talk significantly about the KPIs here in just a few slides. But it's more than just having, you need more than just a comprehensive set of KPIs. You don't just need more on just about system performance, but you need to think about it through impacts and to the measure. How is it driving revenue, brand health, those other things? You need several layers of the KPIs. So one of the things that actually we're in the process of finalizing right now is a white paper that's really focused on those KPIs and those things. And so if it's something you're interested in, please do feel free to reach out and we can share that with you as well. And the last thing is about a cross-functional team, right? So the integration of the technology is there to support the customer experience, but I need to make sure that it's integrating into other areas. So think about now even supply chain. How many companies did not have a full e-commerce strategy or have the ability to change their supply chain overnight? The technology needs to be able to support those things. I need to look at it more with a strategic lens and think about how does it impact other parts of the organization rather than just the marketing organization itself. It needs to be part of the overall technology for the organization as you think about it. So as I mentioned about the survey, and appreciate the folks taking it. Like Sally said at the beginning, if it's something that you haven't had a chance to take, please do go on and take there. We're going to actually take those results and share it with everybody as well, so you can kind of see where do you place, right? So the thing that research is showing really so far is that people are really doing the right thing day to day, but they're not really looking at it strategically. Do they have a plan? Yes, but they really have an in-year plan. They're not really looking at it multi-year. So about 36% have said that they have an annual process that's mainly focused on the funding requirements, with 64% only using that formal process when new tech is needed, but less than 20% actually have a multi-year roadmap, and less than 10% initiate a periodic process for estimating future needs. It's a problem. It's something that you have to think about throughout the process, not just once a year. Majority say that they leverage other functions in the Martech selections, but less than 20% say they're always involved. And less than half actually include other functions in the actual management process itself. Think about the support organizations that you have within your company. Think about the IT organization. Think about procurement. It's, if you think about how critical those are, frankly, to your success and the organization's success, if you have that few people actually involved, that's kind of bad. You're probably missing something there, right? And then most kind of collecting and reporting on KPIs, but not necessarily thinking about the insights into it, no drill downs. For instance, the marketing team or the type of activity being run, they're just really producing a stat. But the question is it good? Is it bad? Are there any recommendations for performance? Those are those key things to think about. So this next slide, and I know it's maybe a little bit of an eye chart, but I actually think it's very critical to how you think about, like, how do you get the most out of your Martech stack, right? Especially if you think about the next 6 months. And how do we then start to say, if I have 50 platforms or 100 platforms, how do I focus on the platforms that are most important? How do you do that? How do you go about determining and defining that? So first, what we say is you really need to start by gathering the marketing KPIs. And there's two kind of key steps to take. First, take your overall, think about the things that impact the customer experience and really have that biggest impact on the satisfaction and the retention of the customers and which interactions are the most important to keeping your clients. Next, once we have that, we need to make sure that the KPIs have alignment to the overall corporate strategy and goals. And we want to start laddering those KPIs under the goals. Then if we take the, say, 250 KPIs or whatever it is that your organization has, that you need to drive over the next 6 months. Then we need to start to create a screening criteria to think about what are the key ones. How do I get from the top of the 250 you have down to the, like, say, 45, for example, that you need to drive stuff. So you start to look at some of the key criteria for prioritizing, right? So you think about the linkage to customer or the company or the channel strategy. You think about the linkage to the performance of the organization. Are they actionable? Are they something you can actually glean insight from and do something to them? Do I have the ability to measure them today? If it's going to take me implementing a bunch of new technology and doing other things and I can't actually measure it, is that something I should be focused on, right? And then think about what are the leading practices as well, and what are those things that are the most important, right? And this will really, if you think about the data, this will really, and what you have, it's really important to allow you to really start to prioritize that technology as it supports the KPIs, right? And then if you think about then starting to make progress on this, you're going to want to do it in waves, right? You're not going to want to try to do all 45 at a time. You're going to want to start to focus on those top priority ones. And then, if time and money and energy to continue, then you start to add on those. But you always want to then tie this back to the platforms that I need to drive those KPIs. If the KPIs are the key, then what's that technology I need to be able to support those? So with that, Sally, let me take just a second before we kind of jump into then some of the 3 key recommendations. Are there any questions that's come in so far?
Yeah, Jason, thank you so much for this. I think we've got a couple questions here. Firstly, how do you determine which marketing technology in your stack is really aligning with your strategy, right? Beyond looking at your KPIs, what are some of those ways that you can understand how that tech is aligning with the overall marketing strategy?
That's a great question. I mean, if you don't have the KPIs, and I'm sure a lot of people have them, and they have them in different, maybe they measure them differently and they look at things. And so they say, Jason, I don't have time to do that. What are some other things I can do? Some things you could potentially do, I guess, with it is, how do I get maybe some of my key people in a room? It doesn't need a 2-month investigation, but how do I get some of my key people in the room and really start to put that puzzle together, right? What questions do we absolutely have to have the answer to and say to keep going for the next 6 months, right? And start to brainstorm kind of at a team. You can also even start to look at the activity of the system itself, right? What systems are being used the most? And then look at what value is that system even driving? Why are people actually using it? Why, what's it doing? Why are you doing it? How are you doing it? And start to maybe drive some things off of that. But you gotta, at the end of the day, you have to tie it back to the overall corporate strategy and what you're trying to do.
Right. And who in the team, you mentioned bringing together kind of those key players, who in that marketing team is responsible for building this long-term plan as you've laid out, and who are those key individuals that you want to make sure are in the room so that everybody is in alignment as you move forward?
Yeah, that's another great question. You know, and so every organization is going to be a little bit different, right? But ultimately, I look at it as kind of the CMO is responsible for having somebody on their team or themselves who's kind of helps put this together, right? You need somebody who is responsible on your team for driving these to drive like your KPIs and your measurement and those sorts of things, right? And if you really want to then think about who's in the room, you want it cross-functional, and you don't necessarily just want it in a room full of marketers, right? We talked about the importance of making it cross-functional. Think about, and it's obviously every organization can be different, but do I need to have sales there? Do I need to have service there? Do I need to have other partners, right? Partners outside of my company that are impacted by my business and I work with very closely, do they need to be there? You need to have finance in the room, right? They're going to have a lot of that data and stuff that you need. You should probably have IT if they're supporting your marketing technology. So you want to make sure that it's a cross-functional team, but obviously not so big as well that you actually don't get anything done.
Love it. Fantastic. And, you know, I've got another really interesting question here, which is, shouldn't you have identified your KPIs before you bought a platform? And I think this is a really interesting question, just especially considering where we are today. So I hope you could touch on that a little bit before we move on.
Yeah, well, yes, I think is the most simple answer to that question. Absolutely. But as I was talking about before, that doesn't necessarily happen, right? People haven't really thought about it very strategically when they go do it. They really are trying to plug holes, right? And we're talking about, I just want to fix a problem. I need insight into this, or I need to send out a campaign, or I need this. And so what they do is they just go buy a piece of technology to fix the problem. They don't think about how it plugs back into the overall strategy of your organization, of marketing, of anything, right? And so it's just these other things you need to think about. Unfortunately, it hasn't happened all the time, but it's not too late. You can absolutely get started on that now and make that a focus.
Excellent.
So great.
So I know I do have a couple more questions. I promise to the audience that we will address at the end. But just to kind of keep on this flow, Jason, I am going to just kind of continue the presentation forward. And let's just focus in on where people really need to be focusing their Martech efforts today.
Yeah, absolutely. Slide here. So if we really think about it, and we're gonna cover these. Myself and Craig are gonna kind of cover, you know, what are some of these actions that you need to take to drive that impact overall, right? So first area we're gonna talk about is accelerating the data and kind of insight generation, right? Then Craig is gonna talk about fully exploiting the existing Martech that you have today. And then we're gonna wrap up by talking about addressing kind of the underutilized or unutilized Martech that you might have already purchased. So the first area that we're going to talk about is really that accelerating the data insights and generation, right? So we talked about really taking that focus on the KPIs that make the most sense, right? And then what's the data and insights ultimately that you need, right? Can you start to put a different lens on it a bit, right? And if you can get at those KPIs, right, in the markets and products and brands and geos that you really anticipate will be the drivers of your business in the next 6 to 12 months, then those are the ones you want to start with, right? It's not going to be all of the brands and all of the geos and everything, right? You can't get everything harmonized in the next 6 months. I like to say, don't let perfect be the enemy of good, right? Start to really look at that 80-20 and how do I start to actually make some progress on the stuff that I actually have. So the question then is, what are the quick wins then, and what are the kind of near-term solutions that can be done? So the first thing I need to do is really do a health check of my KPIs, right? Really begin to understand the quality of the data that I have to support it, right? Then I need to start to look at data velocity. And it's really looking at making sure that I have the right data at the right time, and it's critical, right? Because if the data, first off, is too late, right? Say if I'm getting a report on people who leave my shopping cart abandonment, I'm getting that a week later, probably doesn't do me very much good, right? I need real-time actionable data. The other flip side of that, though, is getting it too early, right? How do I actually because if I get the data too early and I'm making decisions based off of that, and it's not a full, complete picture, I might be making the wrong decisions. So making sure that I have the right data at the right time is important. then it's also, you want to make sure that those calculations are really being measured the same way across the company. It's interesting based on who you talk to sometimes in a single company, like, well, I measure my KPI this way. I measure my KPI this way. I'm like, aren't they the same KPI, right? So we need to make sure that we're measuring it in the same way. Then the next thing is reviewing of existing dashboards. And let's be honest, everybody has dashboard upon dashboard or report upon report. But it's really going to make sure that you have the right dashboard that has the right data, that you're pushing it to the right people, but most importantly, making sure that they actually know how to use it. How do they interpret it to make the best decisions off of it, right? That's really the only way to see an impact on the bottom line. So the next then is for more near-term type things, right? If you think about quick wins over the next just couple months and then near-term kind of finishing out your years, the one thing you need to do is start to continue to standardize the data. Once again, this isn't something that's just going to be all done overnight. It's going to be something that takes a bit. But if you focus on the key KPIs and you focus on the data you need to drive those, how do I start to standardize that? And then you want to start to implement kind of test and learn, right? It's about really improving my analytical decision making. I want to make sure that I have the right people with the right knowledge. So you might honestly have to take a handful of people and you might have to train them, right? I might have to then try to bring them up to speed so they know not just how to interpret the data, but what to do to it. How do I make a recommendation back to the overall organization, right? Because they need to be able to substantiate the decisions. You need to hold them accountable for using data to substantiate those decisions, right? So focus on the key people, the key brands, the key KPIs. Don't focus on everyone. Everyone else will come along. You really want to make sure that you focus on the key stuff. Before going to the next recommendation, is there any other questions before I pass it to Craig? Any questions in this section?
Yeah, thank you, Jason. You know, this is an interesting question. It's something we think about and talk about a lot at the CMO Council, which is, you know, around the CMO-CIO relationship. So a lot of existing Martech today was bought without consulting the CIO, or at the very least, the CIO wasn't brought in until after the fact, right? Moving forward, as we as marketers make more use of our existing assets and accelerate these data and insights generation, how important is that CMO-CIO relationship, and what do you think needs to change?
That's a great question. And, you know, in the world where you say, okay, well, marketing, I'm a silo, right? Then maybe you don't have to talk to the CIO. But we all know that a customer doesn't obviously just work with you I just talked to marketing, right? They expect a full comprehensive experience, kind of more end to end. And so that relationship with the CIO is more important now than ever, especially as I talked earlier about the integrations. I talked about the data. If I'm trying to create the best customer experience I can, whether they're talking to the customer service person on the phone, or they're in a chat, or they're being marketed to, or the salesperson is going in and engaging with them, I need to make sure that I have a good quality, consistent experience for them. You can't do that if all of your stuff is in a silo. Also, CIOs are experts in purchasing technology and managing technology. So you want to make sure you leverage that as much as possible, especially as you look to keep down costs. There's a lot of things that the CIO can bring to the table to have you think about, how do I actually save costs in this space, in this area? It's really critical. So, and that, if I can add just one thing actually to that as well, I think the CIO is really important, but also think about procurement organization. I know sometimes for the word procurement's a bad word in some organizations, maybe with the marketing group, but they have a certain skill set that's really there to support you, right? They can actually help you acquire the technology faster and really help make sure you get kind of the best rates and stuff with it as well. So make sure you're using those support organizations as much as possible.
Excellent. And now this is a little bit more of a tactical question, but how would a team determine the total cost of ownership of each piece of its Martech stack?
Well, so, you know, it's interesting. As you look at total, and I think everybody obviously knows what total cost of ownership is and that we can measure it. And, you know, I want to look at not just obviously my cost of acquiring it, but what is it to maintain it and manage it. But I actually think one of the key parts there is just the opportunity cost as well, right? How are you making sure you're focused on the right things? Because you might have lost value because I'm not focusing on the things that are there. A lot of people just say, oh, well, if I purchase this piece of technology, it's really, or don't purchase this piece of technology as well, right? Because say, oh, I don't want to purchase it because my total cost of ownership is X. Well, you might not then be getting in the market and doing certain things. Maybe it's retargeting or something like that. which then says, okay, well, I guess it's good that we didn't spend the $1 million or the $500,000 or whatever that number is, but did you know we lost $10 million in opportunity costs because we didn't have a way to maybe retarget people who left the shopping cart, right? And so make sure you're thinking about it more holistically, that you're not just thinking about it in terms of just total cost of ownership.
Great. Jason, if you don't mind, I'm going to ask you one more question that's coming from the audience that I think is really interesting, and then
Sure.
I'll let you pass it all along to Craig. But going back to, bringing in those key stakeholders into the room, this person wants to dig into that a little bit further and talk about those cross-functional team members to keep it simple, but at the same time make sure those cross-functional teams are in alignment.
Yeah, so is the question, who do we bring in or how many people? Help me understand that one a little bit better.
Yeah. Kind of who do you determine, how do you determine who those critical cross-functional team members are as it relates to all of this, right? Because you want to find that balance of having too many cooks in the kitchen, too many folks in the room, but at the same time having that strategic alignment across those critical actors so that as you move forward with your strategy, there's that alignment there. So how do you determine who those critical cross-functional stakeholders are?
Yeah, no, that's great. Thank you for that clarification. I mean, I think about it almost in a way of like a racing, right? So who's involved in my process overall, who should be involved in my process. You can't bring obviously everybody from the organization in, but make sure you have your key marketing people in there and then your key support functions, right? And you want to bring them in at different times. If I'm having the conversation, for instance, around my KPIs, right, and how they tie to strategy and maybe not system performance KPIs, maybe at that moment maybe I don't need technology in the room, or maybe I don't need organization X in the room. But at that point, maybe it's finance, right? Or once I've determined what my KPIs are and I'm starting to think about how do I get that, well, I probably really need to make sure I have IT in the room, right? Maybe I need a little less marketers in the room, but more IT in the room, and more maybe finance in the room who maybe has access to certain parts of the data. So I think it's going to really determine what part of the process that you're in, but just make sure, I think the key is make sure that you're just not doing it in a silo, which I think is more important than anything else, right? And even think about kind of the legal and privacy and those kind of risk and stuff like that and regulation. You got to make sure that these are a part of that process as well. So always make sure it's cross-functional. Just don't have too many, and make sure you're bringing in the right people at the right times. Think about it as an overall project. You're not going to have everybody into everything, but you need to make sure that you're checking in with the right groups at the right time and make sure you get the right input. So with that, just to kind of keep us going, why don't I go ahead and actually pass it to Craig, and he can actually take us through the next two areas. So we'll start with fully exploiting the existing technology. Craig?
Perfect, thanks. And just to verify, can you hear me loud and clear?
Yep.
Yes, we can.
All right, wonderful. Perfect. So, one of the key things to take into account right now, especially in such a volatile environment, is the ability to react with agility. Not only does this ensure survival, but it ensures you are able to effectively grow and come out of these types of situations thriving instead. And while this clearly has roots in the software development lifecycle, Agile is clearly starting to become much more pervasive within the marketing organization in general. And so let's talk a little bit about how you can maintain agility within your marketing technology stack to help you drive those KPIs we were talking about. And one of the things I do want to remind folks is, as we get into this, that in a lot of cases, you're going to need to choose a place to specifically focus. Where do you see the highest potential for value? So in the very first quick win here, this idea of auditing your license agreements, right? What we're really talking about here is taking a look at your inventory of marketing technology, who owns it and who's using it. Because in a lot of cases, there's significant opportunity for, number one, reducing unused licenses. For example, let's say I have a workflow tool, which are typically based on number of seats, right? If I have recently, say, off-boarded an agency, for example, I might have a couple dozen or even a couple hundred seats to go ahead and remove there, which can drive immediate cost reduction while of course ensuring that I've got open seats for people to go ahead and add in as new folks come into the organization. But the auditing of licensing is also important in the respect of, in a lot of cases, organizations we work with have multiple implementations of the same technology across, for example, different geographies or different lines of business. And there's usually significant savings you can go ahead and go after by consolidating those to a single implementation and a single contract, which makes it far easier to manage and far easier to make changes to it in the future as well, so you can maintain that agility. Now, if we actually move down a little bit here into this idea of user adoption, one of the things Jason was really trying to drive home when he was talking was about the idea of making sure you can actually measure what's happening. I'm sure all of you are well aware, I mean, my computer in particular is way better at keeping track of data and information than I am by writing it down by pen and paper. And so when we're able to get more people to use the key components of technology that are actually going to help drive through the data to feed our key measurements, feed our KPIs, we're in a much better place to go ahead and actually make informed strategic decisions. But in a lot of cases, this is going to actually require an adoption push for things that are currently taking place outside the technology. Or it might even require a training and education push internally to ensure people not only know how to use your tech from a strategic standpoint to actually go after that vision, but also just from a point-and-click standpoint. Several of the clients I've worked with have technologies where the key owner has left the organization, months ago, and it hasn't been picked back up to actually be a key focus. And so getting people trained and educated is a huge, huge priority to making sure you can maximize the value of the tech you've got. And there's no better time than today to do this because tons of technology organizations are providing all of their training free of charge or heavily discounted. So definitely take advantage of that. And then piloting of unused capabilities is also worth looking into. If you bought a suite or a platform, which came up a little bit earlier, do you do best of breed or individual technologies? Many platform plays come with numerous capabilities built right into them, but in a lot of cases, organizations we work with are only using one or two of the core capabilities there. In fact, a lot of organizations report only using 60% or so of the available technical capabilities they have. So now might be an ideal time to take advantage of those capabilities you've always wanted to pilot, especially if they're going to go ahead and drive towards those key performance indicators you're really trying to impact. Now, if we trade out of this idea of quick wins and move more towards near-term solutions, you're probably seeing the words integrations and processes down there and going, whoa, that's going to take months. Those aren't near-term solutions. But I want to remind again, a key thing here is to choose and focus in the areas that are going to be the highest priority. So a key example on strengthening integration. I've worked with several clients who have workflow tools that do not connect to their execution tools. And this often requires a lot of manual data movement that is copy-paste of campaign IDs, for example, so that you can track the end-to-end campaign. By focusing in key areas and integrating those two types of systems in particular, just as an example, a lot of manual effort can be reduced, and it can speed you to actually getting to the insight you're trying to get to from those key performance indicators. Now, following right along that, this idea of reconciling your KPI metrics, Jason already talked a little bit about, getting your core list of, call it 200, and filtering it down to the key 45. As part of that data audit you were up to in the initial stage, one of the things you're also going to want to identify is if my technology is not currently producing a key piece of data I need to feed a KPI, you're going to want to pop into your marketing tech and make an update to it so that metadata is actually captured and passed through to go ahead and actually inform your reporting layer. And last but not least here, this idea of harmonizing processes. I know many folks are probably going, oh goodness, I got to capture all the processes, and that's an undertaking in and of itself, which is absolutely true. But if we're able to go ahead and have a very focused conversation with our organization about the key gaps or the key hiccups or bottlenecks in existing processes, there's often interim solutions that can be put in place to go ahead and help reduce time to market and help drive agility within the organization so you can go ahead and react faster to the things you're learning. So I'm going to pause right there and check in. Sally, are there any key questions that have popped up before I move into the underutilized section?
Yeah, thank you so much, Craig. So definitely really critical to exploit existing Martech. As we start to look forward, this person has asked that, as we start to downsize the number of Martech platforms in order to cut costs, should they be increasing employee training per platform or the seats that they get so that those employees can do more with less? Are there any other recommendations you'd have, as folks start to maybe limit the number of technologies that they're using, that the employees can still really get the most out of what they have?
Yeah, I think absolutely the idea of increasing employee training on the core platforms or the core components that are going to be remaining in the technology stack is absolutely imperative. That's in fact, one of the key areas I would suggest focusing on, even not in volatile times like today. I think one of the other things or options that factors in that can be really handy and has been proven by research to help actually drive satisfaction of the marketing organization is to actually establish either a COE or a champion of each individual technology that the team can go to and ask questions, and that can actually do things like monthly highlights or weekly highlights of new things that have gone online or new campaigns that have been really successful, to distribute that information and those learnings throughout the rest of the team in the organization. That way, if they're not already aware of how to do that, they can go ahead and immediately jump on those learnings and take advantage of them. And I think, one other piece that factors in, I talked a little bit about harmonizing processes there, is ensuring that as you downsize your technology stack, that your processes are updated to go ahead and actually reflect that. So if we're pulling key components out, we want to make sure we align our processes with getting things to market as quickly and efficiently as possible. So that's another consideration where making changes there not only requires a change to the process, but probably some change management internally to make sure people are fully aware of that change taking place.
Fantastic. Can I just ask you one more question? This listener is talking about specifically one of the challenges that they have, and they're saying that just as you're saying, yes, this person's only using about half of the features on a lot of these tools. But the challenge is that they want to use more of the features and the tools that they have, but they really only use a small piece of each tool that they have in their tool set, right? Are there larger solutions that will allow this person to select the functions they need on more of an a la carte basis, so that they're not sitting there with tech that half of the tools are really just not even using?
Sure. So I think there's a couple of things to take into account there. Technology vendors in a lot of cases do purposely package their technology with additional capabilities to help round out the stack and fill in things that they may want to go ahead and get people to try after they buy, so to speak, right? They buy the core marketing automation capability and they include an optimization capability on top of it. So as for the ability to go ahead and only buy exactly what you want, that does exist, but it does require you to go after it, as mentioned in the question itself, in a bit more of an a la carte basis. And so in certain cases, doing some analysis on, am I actually going to maybe not use every single function in my platform play, but the price may actually end up coming out cheaper than buying, call it 6 or 10 individual tools that would provide me the core capabilities that I actually need. There's certainly a balancing act there. And so the way I like to approach it is to really focus on what are the 5 or 6 things I really need, or what are the 1 or 2 things I'm really trying to get, and focus on developing that core component of my technology stack, making sure that core component has an ability to integrate easily with other technologies, and then basically pulling in what I would call like modularized capabilities with more individual technologies that easily plug and play. And I think this sort of ties back to something that Jason mentioned earlier. I just touched base on strengthening into integration, is that you're going to want things that can integrate easily, that have, you know, a large host of out-of-box connectors, or ability to easily have like open API documentation available for your organization to look at, so you know exactly what you're getting and how to connect it. But I do want to reiterate that, you know, don't let getting the absolute perfect stack where you're not spending a single extra dollar for a capability that is not in use be the enemy of getting an extremely good stack that's probably going to be a heck of a lot easier to manage from a total cost of ownership standpoint in the long term. And in the interest of time, I think we're going to pop into the underutilized section after that question, and moving right down there. The key thing that I want to talk about here is, outside of maximizing the tech you know is core, one of the things you really want to look at is, how do I address the tech that I've got that I know I don't really need anymore, or at least I don't have a use case for it? So, you know, this is where we're really talking about, how do I lower direct cost? How do I reduce technical debt? How do I reduce risk? And, you know, in general, how do I improve my marketer experience so that I can actually improve my customer experience too, right? Because when marketers are happy, they can make a lot of cool changes that make the customers happy as well. So let's dig into this a little bit. And I think the first thing that I really want to talk about here is determining the value of your unused tech. And so what I'm getting at is, like, one of the things Jason talked about earlier was that organizations only actually really sort of conduct ongoing reviews on a consistent basis. Maybe only a quarter of organizations are doing that, and about the same are actually developing a long-term strategic roadmap. So a lot of times we do end up with technology floating around out there that just has nobody who owns it, nobody who uses it. But that doesn't mean you should immediately just flip it off, right? What we want to look at is to tie that technology to the KPIs we're looking at and understand the total cost of ownership before making any decision. And one of the key things I want to talk about here briefly is that in a lot of cases, you're paying for your technology year over year, not month over month, right? So making an immediate decision of, well, we're not using it, just turn it off immediately, might not be the most strategic choice, simply because you might have already paid for it for a year. So what you really want to do is determine, great, it's not in use now, but can I actually put it to use to help drive or impact any of those performance indicators that I really care about? And if I can do that in the next 3 to 6 months, then this is probably worth keeping around, so long as we can identify the resources to go after it. But I think the opposite side of this, which is definitely important as well, is that the technology is not in use and the perceived value for it is not extremely high. It's probably time to pull the trigger and remediate that piece of Martech from your stack, right? And I think what we're really talking about here that's worth taking to note is, don't just immediately pop in and shut it down either, right? In a lot of cases, these technologies could have been used in the past, and they might have a host of really important information or data that you can go ahead and mine. So you want to make sure that you put a migration plan in place to, number one, assess what's in there. Number two, pull anything out that you might need from a legal or from a regulatory standpoint to make sure you've got it. And then also actually communicate to anybody who's actually still designated a user so they know you're going to close it down before you actually go through the process of shutting those pieces of technology down. Now, there's a couple of reasons to go ahead and do this, right? I mentioned obviously the direct cost. If there's direct cost savings, that's awesome. But I think a factor in here are, in a lot of cases, organizations we work with that have 80 or even 100 pieces of technology, a lot of them are actually duplicative in nature, and they're actually muddying the waters and making it more difficult for the marketers to get their jobs done. For example, an organization I worked with last year had 4 different file sharing tools to interact with their agencies, all 4 approved, mind you, but 4 different ones depending upon which team was using it and how they were using it. Now, that created an issue of where do I specifically put which asset to share it back and forth with my agency, and it was very easy to accidentally drop stuff in the wrong tool. And so what essentially we looked at was how do you go ahead and actually remove 1 or 2 of those file sharing tools to reduce the complexity, improve the experience, but frankly also reduce the overall risk of your technology stack. The more tools you have, the more risk there is that something gets mismanaged or something gets put in the wrong place. And so the idea of reducing your technical footprint to simplify things has additional carryover impact that's really important. Now, the last thing I want to touch base on here at the bottom is this idea of developing integrations. I know I talked about strengthening integrations above, but a lot of times tech that's unused is unused simply because it was never connected to the key thing it needed to truly drive impact. And in a lot of cases, that's a data source. In a lot of cases, it's another tool. So in my experience, one of the most common marketing technical components that does not get integrated effectively is a workflow tool to a final deposit point for digital assets or a workflow tool into an actual execution tool. And this drives gaps in your ability to track impact long term. If you can't keep the planning stage linked to the execution stage, you can't track your spend, you can't track the amount of time that went into dedicating or building out all of your assets and all of your components. And it's really important to ensure that those kinds of integrations that may sound kind of basic, but they aren't there, that's one of the key places to go ahead and really focus up on developing integrations. And with that, I am going to, in the interest of time, switch over to the last slide here, and then we'll have a nice solid 10 minutes for Q&A, but I want to make sure we fit this in before I flip back to Q&A. So I know a key thing that everyone here came for is actionable steps to go ahead and actually take, right? You want quick wins. So what we wanted to do was give you very clear steps on what you can walk away and actually start on. And if we tie this back to the first recommendation area that Jason was talking about in regards to accelerating insights and data, we wanted to highlight that, number one, we understand every organization is going to start in a different place, but that number two, no matter where you are in your journey, there are still some great steps you can take to see benefit. And so this top line is really focused on an organization that needs to basically kick off from scratch on the KPI side and gather that list of KPIs and align it with the customer experience, and then ladder those KPIs like Jason talked about to get into the prioritized list of metrics and actually tie them to your marketing technology. Now, if you're a little more advanced and you already have that inventory of KPIs, the next thing you might want to do is actually go down to the second line here and understand how are they being calculated. Jason touched on this thing where many organizations are calculating KPIs in different ways across different parts of the company or different geographies. Making sure you've got a consistent view of the calculation and then looking at the fit gap of the sources of the data. It's not imperative that every single insight is real time, but it is important that you determine what is the appropriate amount of time that I need this refreshed on and actually ensure you can get there. And in certain cases, you might have to stand up an interim solution to go ahead and do that. You might have to drop some data into a data lake or a database to move it around and massage it to actually enable that KPI to be calculated in the near term. But in a lot of cases, that's going to drive a heck of a lot more value than the actual time it took to go ahead and build that out. And last but not least, for the organizations that feel furthest along, where they've got a huge host of dashboards, they've got a huge host of reports that are going out on a frequent basis, this idea of, number one, inventorying them and determining the adoption and use metrics of them is key. One of the latest discussions I had with a marketing leader at one of my clients was really around the fact that they had so many reports floating around, but most of them became stale within 6 months because either the person who requested them or the organization had shifted focus to a different set of KPIs. So reducing that technical debt here in that last step of consistently producing a large number of reports that might have KPIs in them that are mismatched, calculated differently, or not truly relevant to the organization is really the key step there to wrap that particular option up. And so with that, I am going to pause and kind of turn things back over to Sally here to check in to see if any additional questions have come in.
Yeah, fantastic. So one of the big questions is with all these ideas for improvement, Craig, where's the best place to start that's going to provide the most immediate value in today's new economic landscape?
Yeah, so I think the best place to start is, I hate to give the standard, it depends, but I think it is going to be a little different for every organization. And so every organization could have varying levels of maturity. And I think in general, the reason we structured the presentation the way we did is because we consider the data and insights component to be the key place to start. But clearly that has sort of tentacles and links into all of the pieces of marketing technology that you've got. So understanding your end goal and your strategic vision is clearly the highest priority, then linking to the actual KPIs that need to be produced to help you steer the organization in the right direction would be the second step in my mind. And then actually looking at how the technology helps you enable that is where you need to go from there.
Excellent. And Jason, I want to pose this question to you. The popular Martech landscape super graphic just dropped. It shows 8,000 vendors. There's some consolidation there. There's a host of new players in there. Actually, 1 out of 5 are new this year, which is pretty cool. How does this impact Martech spend and maximizing assets considering where we are today? Do you think there's going to be a rip and replace with less expensive tools from startups and newcomers?
I think that it's funny. I think that's a great question. I remember when, apparently I've been doing this too long, because I remember when that first came out the very first time, and it continues to grow every year. I personally, I don't think you're going to see, especially over the next 6 months, I don't think you're going to see a kind of a rip and replace to cheaper options at this moment. And the reason I don't think so is I think just frankly, the cost, there's still a cost to it of actually ripping it out, right? Bringing somebody in, helping you think through the requirements and going through that process. And so then implementing it, and then there's a learning curve, right? And you think about how long it takes people to get, up to speed on the technology. So I don't necessarily think you're going to see that. I think actually, and this is obviously just my opinion, I think what you're going to see is a lot of people actually more double down on the existing stuff that they have, right? I think you're going to continue to see this MarTech landscape change and grow, just like we have for the last, 5+ years. I know we had a consolidation, about 10 years ago or so. You started to have some consolidations with Primo was originally bought by Teradata, and Unica bought was by IBM, and you have the spinoffs again, and some of this other stuff happen, right? So I think you're going to continue to get more and more, but do I see people ripping it out and just doing cheaper? I really don't at this point.
Okay, really, yeah, that's interesting. Now, let me ask you your opinion in terms of if folks do you think, do you have any best of breed platforms that you might recommend, best of breed solutions, or should folks adopt a platform approach? That's a great question, and a really good question following kind of, I think, to the MarTech landscape, right? It's not like a finance organization or supply chain or something like that where you can sit there and say, hey, I'm going to go ahead and implement Oracle or SAP, and that's going to give me 90% of everything I need or 95% of all I need, right? Even if you think about some of these platforms that are out there in the marketing space, quote unquote platforms, I'll say, like say Primo, for instance, who covers a wide breadth of areas, and they do a lot of things, right? Marketing operations and content and some of this other stuff. But that could never be your single platform, right? For everything that you need to do in marketing. I think they would tell you the same thing.
Salesforce would tell you exactly the same thing. There's some things that they do, but they don't necessarily do as much around like the marketing operations function. So you're never, I think, going to get, I guess never is a big word, but no time sooner you're going to get to a point where I can get kind of to a single solution that works. I think in marketing though, and almost we almost celebrate, right, the idea that I need a stack of technology, right? You think about Scott Brinker and Chief Martech, where not only does he put out this landscape, but they also in their conference do it the Stacky Awards, right, which is celebrating good quality marketing tech stacks. So I think, and it was part of the question was asked to Craig earlier too. It's something to really think about in terms of making sure that, as Craig said, don't let perfect be the enemy of good, right? If I have a piece of technology that maybe handles, it could do, 5 things I needed to do, but I bought it for 1. Well, does the other 4 actually okay, right? Maybe it's not like the best of breed. It's not the best at that one little thing, but is it good enough, right? Do I really need to spend this extra time and complexity and everything to get this other piece of technology? And that's something to really think about. But anyway, hopefully that answers your question.
Yeah, I think that's a great answer. Craig, I've got one specifically for you. What would you tell a client who's in this new normal and says that they're too busy to focus on consolidating the multiple redundant MarTech solutions that are currently, muddying their workflow? What would you say to them?
Yeah, so I think 2 things would factor into that for me. One, I think that being too busy to focus on the marketing tech stack is probably an approach that should be reevaluated in the respect that if we continue operating the way we are without doing anything new and actually looking into the future, then the odds of our results changing are pretty slim. And so what I think needs to be done is, number 1, to sit down and understand the impact that change could truly have on actually reducing the number of technology solutions you've got. But I think before you start making decisions on just simply reducing redundant technology solutions, one of the things that really should be focused on is going about implementing and executing a test and learn strategy with the technologies you've got. So we talked a little bit about focusing on where do we see tech having the most potential for impact if it's currently underutilized or duplicative. One of the things that may need to be done is to look at how can we test each of these technologies side by side for a couple of weeks or a couple of months to determine where we're truly seeing an impact before we actually start to make any decisions on reducing the tech. But I think at the same time, that's going to drive efficiency in anything you're doing out there at the moment, because with so much that has changed in the past couple of weeks and months, the old gut instincts we have, the old, for example, predictive models that we have, and I'm calling them old in a relative term, right? They're less than a month old, but the way things have shifted have made a lot of those feelings and a lot of those decisions that could be made using those models much less impactful than they traditionally would have been if things stayed consistent. And so employing a test and learn strategy is really imperative to not only improving the marketing efforts that are out there today, but in determining which of those technologies should actually stick around and continue to be used within the stack. So hopefully that helps.
Yeah, that's wonderful. So everyone, we're just a couple minutes away from the hour mark. Now, it's funny, I've gotten quite a few questions here asking about where content fits in to the equation. And, your head is in the same place that our head is at, because next week, as part 2 of this webinar series, we're going to be focusing on how to optimize the value of your content spend. So for those folks that are asking me those questions, I promise you these are the questions that we're going to be addressing next week. So I'm really excited to have everyone join us next week as we continue on this conversation. Same day, same time, May 14th, 1 p.m. Eastern. I am going to be sending a follow-up email to all of you, just, sharing this deck with you, sharing the on-demand link to view it so that you can come back and review this information. Again, I know this is a lot of information and helpful insights to go through, so we want to make sure you have the tools to review it. And I will be sending just that link to participate in the survey if you haven't already. I know so many of you have already, and we really appreciate that. But for those of you that haven't yet had the chance, you still have a chance to do so. And that summary of the findings is going to be really instrumental as you move forward. So with that, I want to extend a big thank you to our two speakers, Jason, Craig. Thank you so much for taking the time to chat with us today and share these recommendations with our audience.
Thank you for having us.
Great. Thank you so much for the chance.
Thank you, everyone. And I hope everybody has a wonderful rest of their day.